Thin spaces, those places and people who make the division between us and the divine minimal. The experiences reminding us that the divine breaks into this world and leaves its mark like fire singes bark. Our souls are not the same after we experience these thin places. Sometimes they are physical places, other times they are people. We can see these places in people regularly, and other times these thin spaces are once-in-a-lifetime experiences. Yet no matter how frequently our souls are marked with the fire of the divine, we know we have been marked. When life gets unnerving, we can visit these spaces in person or in our soul's memory and be met again by the divine. A meeting with the divine stirs a peaceful understanding in our souls. There are times when the space finds us unexpectedly, when we are grieving, doing advocacy work, engaging in ministries here at the church, taking a drive, being with family or friends, our dreams, the beauty of birth and the finality of death, singing, sharing communion, the stillness while you're the only one awake, the breeze that breaks a breezeless day. Then spaces find us and we can seek them out. This we learn from our text today. Moses had his thin space seek him out and come upon him, while Elijah sought his out. Our lives can experience both of these in any given moment, and certainly in any given lifetime. The divine dances with our soul's needs, knowing when and how to meet us in these sacred places. As I wrote a sermon for this Sunday, I was caught up in all the thin spaces I have encountered in my life, all those beautiful moments in nature or sacred conversations with friends, the places that hold the rawest moments my heart and soul have been known to experience. I finished writing that sermon Friday night, before news reports of white supremacists taking to the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, wielding torches and chanting, "You will not replace us," and blood and soil. I had this moment as I read these news reports of wanting to be in one of those sacred thin spaces where the divine and I feel as if we are in the same place, taking in the same breath together. As I went to bed, I prayed for the rally scheduled for Saturday and what it would hold. When I woke, I learned the streets of Charlottesville were filled with hate and with love. There were neo-Nazis and white terrorists and white nationalists walking the streets, no hoods covering their faces or darkness of night concealing their identities. As the air was filled with bigotry, hatred, and racism by those who were there for the rally, they were met with clergy marching in silence, who then formed lines along the road and sang "This Little Light of Mine." Interfaith clergy who came together to speak love into the air of hatred. In reading the news headlines and accounts from colleagues and friends of mine who were in Charlottesville, I felt the pains of my heart drawing me to feel hopeless and at a loss, yet somehow not surprised. Wishing a thin space so vast that it could overcome all that was happening in Charlottesville and make everything peaceful and well was what my soul longed for. Yesterday progressed, and I realized the sermon I had written was not the sermon for today. So I sat in the tension of this weekend's events, and I wondered what our text had to say. Moses encountered God when he came across a burning bush as he was tending to his father-in-law's flocks. From what we can tell in Scripture, Moses was content with his life and wasn't seeking for change in any of his plans. But that's what met him in that thin space of the burning bush. God was calling Moses to be the leader of the Hebrew people, a leader to free them from slavery of Pharaoh. Moses said he wasn't ready and didn't believe that he could convince the people to follow him. God reminded him that even though he would be the person they could visibly see leading them out of slavery, that it was God who's going with them for the long journey and doing the hard work. In this thin space, Moses was named a leader and one who would stand up to Pharaoh and bring release to the captives. Moses was not seeking to hear from the Lord or expecting to find a place where the divine met him. Yet that's what he had. He was at work, and God found a very unique way of getting his attention because the message was necessary for Moses to get. Unlike Moses, Elijah had gone to the wilderness in hopes to find and hear God. It could be said he was seeking for a thin space. Elijah had retreated because the Israelites had forgotten their covenant with God and killed the other prophets, and Elijah was the only one left. He was in distress and his soul was weary. He wanted to keep going with what the covenant called of him, but he was worn and tired and needed an experience of thin space. As he was in the cave, he heard a voice say, "Go to the entrance, for the Lord is about to pass by." There was no burning bush that God spoke to Elijah through. In fact, the divine was not speaking through a gale-force wind that shattered rock, nor the earthquake, nor even fire this time. God knew Elijah's spirit was raw and withered and needed a balm unlike any other. As Elijah stood at the opening of the cave, the sound of sheer silence overtook the place, and he was greeted with a still, small voice. And it was the voice of the divine. And in this conversation, Elijah was told to carry on and continue the work, that those he would be met with would be able to actually continue along with him. His soul was renewed, and he was reminded the work he is doing is not of his own strength or ability, but the divine that resides within himself, around him, and in those he would be working with. God met Elijah in a way he would ensure to hear the message. These ancestors of faith teach us that thin spaces are where we meet the divine and are given insight and wisdom for moving forward in our lives and in the work of the gospel. So I take comfort in knowing that my desire to reside in thin space this weekend is not uncommon. The work of following Jesus and seeking to make the gospel an adjective is daunting and can leave our hearts feeling like Elijah's. Can also leave us feeling unnerved like Moses, because sometimes following Jesus means change will come to our lives, even when we don't think it's necessary or when we are ready for it. I was also reminded that these men in our faith tradition did not leave their thin spaces in the wilderness. They carried it with them, their souls singed with God's message as they followed through with their work to make the covenant an action-rooted life. I am aching for thin space. And since I can't remove myself from the evil of this world and retreat to the thin spaces that nature holds so dear to me, I created a bit of thin space for me this morning. I typically don't preach from the center of the chancel, but today I needed scripture behind me, you in front of me, and me standing between the pulpit and lectern, creating a cross of sorts for me to stand in the open space of. Needing thin space is understandable, and perhaps you are needing thin space too. It's important for me to note, though, no matter how much I wish for thin space, I am not a person of color who felt the acts of this weekend as a magnifying glass to what their lives are on a regular basis. To my brothers and sisters of color, we see you, we love you, and we will stand with you. The work of ending white supremacy is not your work. It is the work of your white brothers and sisters, like myself. My prayer is that you can find thin space this morning as we worship. When I watched the video footage from Charlottesville, I was overcome with a feeling of anguish and sorrow because I can't understand the desire to defend such hate by calling it heritage. Then I realized those people of faith from various backgrounds of beliefs, various races, and differing abilities were the thin space in Charlottesville this weekend. Thin spaces aren't always reserved for the wilderness, but can be people of faith willing to proclaim that the gospel of Christ is one that names diversity as beauty, recalls history as fact, but will rectify the harm so that it doesn't carry on, and are willing to be a peaceful presence in tumultuous times. The clergy and people of faith were thin space in Charlottesville this weekend, and God spoke through them. Moses was charged with leading the Hebrew people out of slavery. Elijah was charged with carrying on the work of the covenant. And we are charged to live out the gospel. Part of living out the gospel is for us to call out hate and not allow it to persist in outright harmful ways, as we saw our brothers and sisters stand up to those neo-Nazis in Charlottesville do. But more often than not, it will be in those discreet, quiet moments when we speak up, to those tough and awkward conversations when we encounter someone who utters a racist comment and then dismisses it as a joke. The work of the gospel doesn't have to be standing on the sides of the roads singing "This Little Light of Mine." It might at times, though. But more often than not, it will be asking loved ones who have said harmful things and don't realize it, why they said it, and engaging in the tough work of conversation. And then saying, I need you to know that that's not okay to say in my presence. The gospel calls us to create space for the beloved in each of us to thrive in the truth of love, grace, and justice. So when we see or hear those questions or comments that are only given to people of color, we don't allow our silence to make it seem okay. The stories of Moses and Elijah remind us that sometimes our charge is to carry on the light of love, even when we don't feel equipped or emotionally ready. Our texts today remind us that we may be the physical ones present in these gospel-filled moments, but it is God who journeys with us, who is doing the work. God connects to us through these thin spaces in our lives. Gospel work will often mean we then need to retreat to those thin spaces that rejuvenate us, those places that remind us why we are doing what we are doing. With the thin spaces singed on our souls, we know we actually have a far more powerful message than those neo-Nazis who were screaming this weekend. Our message is so powerful that even with their bigotry and hate that they hold in their lives, they are children of God too. And the work we do is for all of us to live from that freedom so that we don't have to be afraid of those who are different or fearful of losing false power. To those who are white supremacists, I say we are equally human, equally children of God, equally the beloved. And I will admit, I do not want to call those torch-wielding people beloved. But that's the thing. I'm not the one who calls them beloved. God does. So I hope we can hear in the gospel that we are all responsible for collectively responding to hate with love and not allowing hate to have the last word. As much as I want to retreat to those thin spaces that remove me from the evil of this world, and how much I wanted to lean into the cowardly truth that I didn't want to preach this message today, I am reminded by the messages of Moses and Elijah that the gospel work means confronting evil in the eye and saying, not here, not in this place, and never again. White supremacy is not in line with the gospel. We need to name it as sin because that is what it is. And that's part of our gospel charge is to actively engage in anti-racism work. This morning, you may be learning of the atrocity in Charlottesville for the first time. You may be like me and aching for thin space because the headlines were so gut-wrenching. Wherever we are this morning, it is vital for us to keep in mind that whether Charlottesville happened or not, this kind of hatred fills our country on a daily basis. And the work to end it would still be there. So, what might we do to move forward, emboldened by our thin spaces, to work towards racial justice? Thankfully, at Calvary, we have a few avenues to do just that. Our monthly mission partner, Interfaith Alliance of Colorado, has another Facing Racism cohort beginning this fall. These cohorts are guided by 4 professional facilitators consisting of 20 people from multiple congregations who commit to 6 sessions of intentional learning, growth, and action centering around the Black Lives Matter movement and the experiences of Black people. If you're thinking you need something that's a bit closer to home to begin this journey, this fall I will be leading a GPS group on the book, Trouble the Water, a Christian resource for working for racial justice. This book is designed for individuals and congregations endeavoring to take seriously the ever-increasing necessity of work toward racial justice, while attending to the intersections of our identities and the intersecting nature of oppression, injustice, and violence. This GPS group will consist of 8 to 12 people, and we will read the book together, and we will hopefully share earnestly what our experiences are and what may make it difficult or tricky for us to engage in this work, or how you have been oppressed by racism as a person of color. We will also be continuing our work with New Hope Baptist Church. On October 15th, we will be hosting New Hope Baptist Church here at Calvary, And we'll work on the areas of community engagement, working with this partner in faith and engaging the areas of injustice in our city. We work towards racial justice as well. New Hope is a predominantly African American congregation, and Calvary a predominantly Anglo. And together we work for the gospel, learning the stories of their congregates and sharing the stories of ours. And together we address the racial injustice that exists in the church at large. But let us never forget the important work of having these conversations with our family and friends, beginning with exploring the history of racism in our country and how it manifests today. How does it make your family feel that people are treated differently because they are a person of color? Who in our lives could we speak to and have honest conversation with so that we could hear the stories of people of color with no other agenda than to hear their story and allow holy ground to be created between us? If actively standing up to white supremacy is a new journey for you, or if you are a lifelong worker for racial justice, may you know God journeys with you. God calls us to this work and will not leave us. Just as he did not leave Moses to free the enslaved, nor did he leave Elijah to care for the oppressed and stop the Israelites from being the oppressor. God calls us. And no matter where we find ourselves in the journey of discipleship, we know that thin spaces will be part of our path, singeing our souls with the divine's love and peace, calling us to the next steps of breathing with the divine's movement in our lives. Moses and Elijah took on difficult work of listening to what God was calling them to, and they did so from their thin spaces. Our thin spaces are equally as holy, and God is equally as present. We will continue the work started by Moses and Elijah and continue the work of joining with the oppressed until all are free, and continuing the work even when it's emotionally raw, because we know we will return to our thin spaces to be rejuvenated so we can press on. Each visit to these thin spaces are ways that God connect and speak to you, and they will leave you changed once more. There were thin spaces in Charlottesville this weekend, and God spoke to us through them. And there will continue to be thin spaces wherever the gospel is spoken and the divine is able to break through and mark the people with the divine love of God. In this sermon series, we are talking about how God speaks to us. From Moses to Elijah, we learn God speaks through the sacred spaces in our lives, thin spaces that were carried on from way back when and are present today, through people of faith who are willing to stand up and say, hate will not have the last word. May we hear from these sacred spaces and stand up and say, we will work for justice for all people, and God's love will be the message that we hear and proclaim to the world. Speak from your thin spaces, for God has met you there. And the world needs your voices and your actions. So go and be the light to the world. Amen.